As the chairman, we have Dr. Pradeep Sharma and Dr. Pramod Pandey. As the conveners, we have Dr. Rashmin Gandhi and Dr. Rohit Sharma.
Not Rohit Sharma.
Actually.
Okay.
On the expert panel, we have Dr. S. Ambika, Dr. Dipankar Das, Dr. Jyoti Matalia, Dr. Mahesh Kumar, Dr. Naveen Jayakumar, Dr. Kumudini Sharma, Dr. K. Rajesh, Dr. Satya Karna, and Dr. Sujata Guha. I invite everyone and welcome to 79th All India Ophthalmological Conference 2021. Thank you. Now we can begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivani. I think we have a very great faculty today, and I think Dr. Rashmin, you are going to introduce them.
Yes, sir.
So I would request him to maybe with permission of Dr. Jagat Ram, we can start the session, and the first.
I think there's some mixing up of modules.
It's a very interesting talk on
Yeah, thank you. So, good evening, everybody. And I think this is probably a very rare occasion that we have a national symposium on neuro-ophthalmology at AIOC. And we would like to thank the All India Ophthalmological Society for accepting our request and consenting to organize this symposium. I heartily welcome Dr. Pradeep Sharma as our chairman of this symposium and all the expert panel. Let's move on to the interesting talks by the amazing faculty that we managed to get here. The first is Dr. Shikha, who is joining us from Chennai. She's the Deputy Director of Neuro-Ophthalmology at Shankar Nethralaya, and she's going to talk on OCT and neuro-ophthalmology. Shikha, all yours.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, that's right.
At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Partha, Dr. Rashmin, for giving me this opportunity to talk on this topic of OCT neuro-ophthalmology. This technique was developed by MIT in the United States in early 90s, and it's very similar to ultrasound. And instead of the ultrasound, it uses near-infrared light using low coherence interferometry. And the beauty or the power of this technology is that it gives high resolution cross-sectional images and it's non-invasive in a non-contact way. We all know the evolution of this technology from time domain to spectral domain to step source OCT. And with each evolution, the technology it gives us faster images, deeper imaging is possible, and better resolutions are possible. To acquaint you with the machines, we have Cirrus and Spectralis, which are the SD-OCT machines. Atlantis is the SpepSource machine, and Zeiss Plex Elite is the OCT angiography machine. Coming to the OCT neuro-ophthalmology, the RNFL health can be imaged using the peripapillary retinal nerve fiber layer thickness analysis. We can come to know about the GCC health by looking at the macular ganglion cell inner plexiform layer thickness analysis. And the structure per se of the optic nerve head can be beautifully studied by EDI OCT of the spectral domain OCT or by using the SpepSource OCT. All the segments of the retina can be seen on EDI mode. This is the RNFL, this is the Bruch's membrane, and this is the lamina cribrosa. Coming to the OCT protocols, the peripapillary retinal nerve fiber layer thickness analysis is done typically by using circular cross-sectional retina scan, which is obtained at a diameter of 3.4 to 3.5 millimeter, which is centered around the optic nerve head. And this is how it appears on Spectralis SD-OCT, and this is how it appears on the Cirrus HD-OCT. We use the optic disc cube 200 into 200 scan on Cirrus OCT. For macular ganglion cell inner plexiform layer thickness analysis, we require retinal layer segmentation, and different machines use different methods. This is how the scan appears on Spectralis, and this is how it appears on the Cirrus machine. And here in Spectralis, we get these two layers, that is the GCC and IP layer thickness separately, whereas in Cirrus, we get it together as a single value. Here it's a circular image, and in case of Cirrus, it's an ellipsoid circle that is studied centered around the macula. I'm not going into the details of how to read these charts of RNFL and GCC. Let's go directly into the clinical application of this technology. The congenital optic disc anomalies have been studied by OCT, and peculiar characteristics have been defined. They can be used as diagnostic adjuncts. Let's look at these cases. So this is a case of optic disc pit, and we have done, as I said initially, if we have to look at the structural defects, then structural problems with the disc, we have to use the SSOCT or EDI-OCT. So this is the SSOCT. SSOCT gives a wider scan. You can also look at the macula. Here you can directly see the pit as this, you can see this dark area. This is the pit, and this is, we know it's associated at times with pit maculopathy. Here you can see these skytic spaces. Now, this is a case of optic nerve head coloboma with a disc pit. Here you can see this is the area which has coloboma, and this is the pit. It can be beautifully captured by this technology. This is a case of morning glory syndrome, and here again using SSOCT, we can see the defect in the left eye, and what we're seeing is basically this is the neurosensory detachment in the peripapillary area. These are forms like defects in the peripapillary area, and this is the glial tissue at the surface. Even the hypoplastic disc can be diagnosed easily on the OCT. You can see a smaller disc area and a smaller cup, and it's associated with thinning of the peripapillary retinal nerve fiber layer. This is the EDI OCT of the hypoplastic disc. Now, coming to this, what is it? Any guesses? It's not a disc. It's, look where the scan is going from. It's a choroidal coloboma. And this is the retinal nerve fiber layer, which is dipping into the colobomatous area. Now, let's move the section through the optic nerve head, and what we get is we get a nice and big, large cup here. You want to compare it with normal optic nerve head. This is through the normal optic. This is a normal optic nerve head, and this is how it's looking here. So what does the patient have? The patient has glaucomatous optic atrophy. This is a huge, large cup here, but look at the fields. This is not advanced glaucoma. So what is it? This is a case of optic nerve head coloboma, which has been kind of aborted. How do you differentiate from glaucoma? Why do you say it's not an advanced cupping? You see this dark line here on both the sides. This is not seen normally. This is seen in case of coloboma. Now coming to the OCT in non-calcified drusen's, we published this paper where we claimed that we could directly view the optic nerve head drusen as hyperreflective masses above the RPE. And these are some more images. And we also said that in case of true edema, true papilledema, there was a triangular hyporeflective area. Whereas in case of pseudoedema, we noticed that there was a hyperreflective echo. Instead of this big, large hyporeflective triangular area, we noticed that this area space was filled with this hyperreflective echo, and which at that point we thought was the direct visualization of the drusen. There were many studies at that time which claimed similar things, and there were studies which there was a lot of confusion around the topic. A consortium was formed, and the consortium said that the drusen actually was a hyporeflective area with these superior crinated margins, and it said that to visualize this, you require SDOCT EDI mode, 97 sections, and you can also pick up the autofluorescence in case you're using spectralis machine. So we looked for it, and we also found the drusen. And what we had, see, this is the drusen defined by the consortium, and this is the discrete lesion which we had initially thought to be the drusen. So what is it? So consortium said that this was actually peripapillary. They termed it as peripapillary hyperreflective ovoid mask-like lesions of forms, and it's a marker of exoplasmic stasis in the optic nerve. Right? And histologically, they have proven it to be herniating optic nerve fibers. Now, these are the EDI OCT images from spectralis and Cirrus machine showing the drusen. Coming to the clinical use of OCT in neuro-ophthalmology, in acute phase of optic neuritis, be it papillitis, retrobulbar optic neuritis, there is flow stasis, exoplasmic flow stasis, hence swelling of the optic nerve head, which is seen as increased RNFL thickness, peripapillary retinal nerve fiber layer thickness. Over 4 weeks, it becomes thinning. Another finding is that if the optic neuritis is because of MS, temporal thinning is more often seen, and in case of NMO spectrum disorder, you get thinning in the superior and inferior quadrants. Another thing is that this peripapillary retinal nerve fiber layer thickness does not correlate exactly with the visual function of the eye, but MGC-IPL layer gives us idea about the visual acuity or the field changes. The MGC-IPL thinning occurs about 2 weeks later. We said that RNFL thinning occurs around 4 weeks later. And this thinning is more severe in case of NMO spectrum disorder disease. Lastly, we look at the examples of MS optic neuritis and NMO spectrum disorder patients. I said this is a case of acute optic neuritis in right eye. There is increased RNFL thickening. You can see here in the right eye. But what we also notice is that the left eye, there is a thinning because of the old attack. Maybe the patient has had a subclinical optic neuritis. And since we have proven here that the patient has had dissemination in time, so this technology can be used to diagnose multiple sclerosis.
Your times.
Yeah, this is my last slide. This is NMO spectrum disorder. As we said initially, the superior and the inferior quadrants are more commonly affected, and this is what was seen in this patient. These are the GCC. I think I'll conclude with this.
Thank you, Dr. Shikha. I think it was a wonderful talk. And I think in neuro-ophthalmology is getting more and more colorful and interesting with these newer gadgets that we are getting, and they are evolving better and better each day. Now that with the adaptive optics, it's going to show us on-fast pictures and showing us much more. So I think as we are in Kolkata virtually, we should say Khela Hobe. So the game is just started beginning for neuro-ophthalmologists.
Thank you, sir. Satya, would you like to?
Yeah, I just have a question for Shikha. So most of the ophthalmologists are, have a particular model of OCT. Traditionally, they bought it 2 years, 4 years, 10 years ago. Do you think the EDI OCT is really necessary for neuro-ophthalmology?
Are those ophthalmologists neuro-ophthalmologists? See, if somebody is coming, somebody is referring a patient or patient's coming you for a neuro-ophthalmology opinion, and you want to really give the best, it's a useful technology.
Okay, so basically the referral neuro-ophthalmologist should have an EDI OCT. That's what you're saying.
Definitely.
Dr. Shikha, I wanted to ask you, the B-scan ultrasound is so effective and cost-effective to pick up at drusen. So that will is an important investigative modality. So how substantiate in the costly?
Sir, we have done ultrasound for all the patients of suspected drusens, and then we started looking for something else when we could not find the drusen, and we did not suspect papilledema. So in a calcified drusen, I agree that ultrasound can pick it up, but the cases where it's a crowded disc and there is a buried drusen, it's difficult to get picked up on an ultrasound. In fact, on OCT also, if you're not following the consortium protocol, you can easily miss it. So if something with such a high resolution is not able to pick it up, then ultrasound may not pick up every buried drusen.
Thank you, Shikha. Thank you, Satya. I would request the organizer that give a sound at the end of 9 minutes, because the speaker may not be aware of the timer, and the discussion is for 2 minutes. Even after 2 minutes of discussion, please give a notice sound. Let me invite Dr. Virender Sachdev for his talk. He's going to talk about optic neuritis. He's joining us from Ali Prasad Institute, Vizag. He's a faculty pediatric ophthalmology and neuro-ophthalmology there. Virender?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Rashmin. Thank you, everyone. And I hope my slides are visible.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay. I would like to begin by thanking AIOS, Dr. Rashmin and Dr. Partha Biswas for giving the opportunity to speak on this important topic, optic neuritis, what's new. We all know that optic neuritis is a continuously evolving field and so much work has happened in this. So I would like to cover this in the following sections. What are the new insights into the etiology? So, and what's based on that, what's new in recommendation in the workup, what's new coming up in the treatment, and what's new understanding in pediatric optic neuritis, and then what is the new spectrum, the increasing spectrum of understanding optic neuritis status post COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccination. So we know that optic neuritis is primarily secondary to demyelination in majority of the cases, and although it can be isolated, but majority of them do have association with some systemic or a CNS neuroinflammatory syndrome. The most common being multiple sclerosis, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, NMOSD, or myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein associated demyelinating disorder. Based on the availability of the serological tests available for the last decade or so, and there have been studies that are coming up. For example, the study from the Western literature that shows the incidence of various etiologies in optic neuritis. So they found that in the Onset County, over almost a decade long study, they found that while multiple sclerosis was still the most common etiology, idiopathic optic neuritis was second most common, but NMOSD and myelin oligodendrocyte associated demyelinating disorders accounted for about 9% of all optic neuritis. That is almost one of the 10 cases. And further, these are associated with more frequent recurrences and suboptimal visual outcomes. Similarly, the pediatric optic neuritis study, which was a prospective study carried out by PDIC group, showed that, again, isolated optic neuritis was seen in only less than half of the patients, while the other etiologies accounted for nearly 50% of them. And among them, most common was MOG-associated optic neuritis. So both the studies are telling us that a large number of them do have a specific neuroinflammatory cause. And the pediatric optic neuritis study also showed that an association with immunological diagnosis was associated with a worse visual outcome. Therefore, this tells us that it is very important for all of us to understand that optic neuritis is just a manifestation, and we need to subclassify it according to the underlying neuroinflammatory syndrome. As the progression of the condition is different, they can be modified and they can have worse visual outcomes and recurrences. So, are there some clinical clues? There have been very good studies which have come up in the recent past, in the last couple of years especially. For example, the study by Hako and colleagues, which showed the classification of multiple sclerosis versus non-multiple sclerosis related optic neuritis. They found that multiple sclerosis was more frequently associated with young and adolescent females, and it was never associated with an edema-like presentation. So these are some important clinical clues that will give us a particular clue. The MOG-associated optic neuritis can have certain specific features. Clinically, presence of hemorrhages is never considered to be typical of optic neuritis. However, MOG-associated optic neuritis can have hemorrhages in the peripapillary area. They can have diffuse CNS dysfunction and seizures at the time of presentation. They can have area postrema-like syndrome, and they can have recurrences, but with relatively good outcomes. So these features, which are coming up in relation to optic neuritis, suggest a particular etiology with MOGAD. Further, the same group by Hecko and others showed classical differences they observed in their series between MOG-associated optic neuritis and NMOSD. And they found that MOG-associated optic neuritis was associated in young children, and they had monophasic disseminated encephalomyelitis, whereas NMOSD was associated more frequently with clinically isolated syndrome other than optic neuritis. So although this study was primarily done in the children because MOG-associated optic neuritis is more frequently seen in the children, but similar differences, for example, presentation with clinically isolated syndrome other than optic neuritis will hold true even in the adults where MOG is also being reported. So based on this understanding, what are the current recommendations for the workup? Do we perform all investigations, neuroimaging, serology, CSF analysis, or there are some clues to decide? We can subclassify this workup into ocular workup as well as a systemic. Ocular one can be for documenting visual function and structural damage. Dr. Shikha already showed about the role of OCT. There can be role of VEP and OCT angiography in specific indications. We will cover it very briefly. As regards the systemic investigations, neuroimaging is possibly the most important. Let's see in little more detail. I'll cover it in this slide. The MRI has been shown to give specific clues to the underlying etiology. This schematic diagram published by Dutra and others in this radiographics article shows a very nice depiction. The multiple sclerosis related optic neuritis tends to involve one side more often. These tend to involve short segments of optic nerve involvement. Spinal cord involvement involves the white matter tracts and tends to be short segments of spinal cord involvement. The periventricular lesions and subcortical long white matter tracts can be affected in multiple sclerosis. In contrast, NMO-related optic neuritis tends to be bilateral, can involve optic chiasm, prechiasmatic optic nerve. Spinal cord lesions tend to involve more than 3 contiguous segments and can involve the central spinal canal also. And then there can be lesions in the periependymal areas where aquaporin antigen is located. In contrast, MOG-associated optic neuritis again tends to be bilateral, but tends to spare the optic chiasm. Again, spinal cord involvement is long segments, but tends to involve the caudal spinal canal, spinal cord. And then there can be multiple white matter lesions in the various areas of the brain and also in the area postrema. So these can be responsible for the constitutional symptoms as well. Given the role of neuroimaging, if we look at these features, it can also guide us to do a serological workup. I'm sorry. So given the pattern that you're observing, you can guide your serological workup, which can be very important in a country like ours where resources are limited. Further, the role of imaging cannot be overemphasized, that where the patients are having seronegative reports, but they do have specific features to tell that this could still be NMOSD. And this has been adopted in the current guidelines for making a diagnosis of seronegative NMOSD. So to summarize, neuroimaging should be the first line investigation. It guides the subclassification of disease and guides further workup and also prognosis. We should all obtain MRI brain and orbits with contrast with special sequences for fat suppression and for fluid attenuated sequences for taking up periventricular lesions. MRI spine ideally in all patients, but especially if there is a recurrent disease. The role of OCT has already been covered by Dr. Shikha, and she already highlighted that it helps differentiate between different types of optic neuritis. It can detect subclinical pathology as well as can provide evidence of dissemination in time and space in patients with suspected multiple sclerosis. So I'll skip these slides, but just to tell that the degree of RNFL loss can also vary in each of these conditions. I would like to highlight the role of OCT angiography. It is not classically needed in a diagnosis of optic neuritis, but it can be useful, especially in patients with atypical features and at extremes of age. We see on the right side the NaION, and on left side, a papillitis. So coming to the OCT angio in NaION, we can observe that there is not only a rarefaction of the peripapillary capillary net, but also specific defects that can be observed. Whereas in optic neuritis, we see disc swelling, we see rarefaction of the peripapillary RNFL that might be observed, but usually there are no perfusion deficits that we observe in optic neuritis. So this is how it can be useful in making a differentiation. Coming to the treatment guidelines, ONTT still holds in classical patients, but in patients, even in a classical patient, the initial treatment can be guided by ONTT. However, it requires that at this point of time, majority of the patients do get a serological testing, and as well as about 5 days of initial IVMP therapy rather than 3 days. Further management. Yeah, I'm about to conclude shortly. As regards the further treatment, after the initial phase of treatment, the further treatment is guided by the final diagnosis, and there is need for immunosuppression. There is again a very important study which tells that which patients will need immunosuppression. MS, definitely yes, because to prevent permanent disability. NMO, to prevent permanent disability and recurrences, and even a single episode can cause mark damage. And MOG optic neuritis, evidence is coming that about 1/3 of them only get recurrences. So for recurrent cases, yes, but in others, it might be observed. There are various treatment options. Among them, plasmapheresis can be used for countering acute episodes, and IVIG again for acute episode. But there are other studies that are coming up for various monoclonal antibodies that can be used in patients with NMOSD. And finally, a word about optic neuritis following COVID-19 infection and vaccination. There have been multiple associations that are coming up, especially recurrences, which could be believed to be secondary to the immune response. And there are patients which are turning out to be negative for both NMO and MOG. So giving us a clue that maybe something direct relation to the infectious etiology could be there. We have to wait and watch about this. With this, I conclude the presentation. Thank you very much for a patient hearing. And I would like to invite you all for upcoming meeting on COVID-19 and eye diseases. We have a very good neuro-ophthalmology session. Hope some of you can join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Virender. Ramesh, would you like to comment?
Yeah. Thank you, Rashmin. Wonderful talk, Viru. Very nicely covered. I just had one comment and probably one question. We have a situation in India, many cases, we can get imaging. I think in the last 1 decade, imaging has become almost mandatory and we do get it. What happens for the biomarkers? Are you able to get in every patient or it's not possible? If you get, still there could be negative. Do you recommend treatment based on an imaging finding? Because whether the seronegativity is because of cell-based assay, there are a lot of things, it matters. What is your experience? This is one question, and I had one more comment after that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh. I think this is a very important point that the sensitivity of the test itself is low, and especially if it is not a cell-based assay. So, and cell-based assays are not easily available in India. So therefore, further on, as I was trying to speak in the presentation also, the neuroimaging does play a major role, and we should continue our treatment based on a strong clinical suspicion. And we should also subclassify as seronegative NMOSD or seronegative MOG. Possibly that's how I do.
Okay. Thank you, Viru. One more comment I had is, if you look at the last decade, we are, at least I am seeing, it's open to all the panelists, less and less of typical optic neuritis related to MS. We are seeing more and more of NMO and MOGAD, these kind of optic neuritis. So every patient, I think finally they are onto the NMO spectrum or the other, where long-term immunosuppression is required. If you don't, they will come with recurrence. If they have 1 or 2 recurrence, then your treatment for the immunosuppression will not be so much effective. Are we going to see one more change because of the COVID? In my practice, at least, I haven't seen so much change in the last 1 year with relation to optic neuritis. Are we expecting one more change in the profile of the optic neuritis in the next half decade or 1 decade? Just wanted to know from others. That's all I had. Thank you.
Ramesh, thank you. I think we'll move on to the talks and maybe we'll have a discussion at the end. Is that okay, Dr. Sharma sir? So that we can have all speakers having their talks full. So next we have from optic neuritis, we are going to AION, and Swati is joining us from AIM. She's an additional professor there in pediatric ophthalmology and neuro-ophthalmology. So Swati Fulzule, it's yours.
Yeah, I would take this opportunity to thank AIOS as well as Dr. Rashmin for making me part of this national symposium. My talk for today is anti-ischemic optic neuropathy, its diagnostic and management aspects. So I would like to share that, as we all know, anti-ischemic optic neuropathy can be of arthritic type and non-arthritic type. I would take you to 3 different cases where it had a different presentation than the typical one. So first was a case of 38-year-old female who complained with sudden loss of vision for few days, had severe headache on both sides of temporal areas, had low history of low-grade fever almost 2 months back, and a history of jaw claudication for 15 days. She had a very, very poor vision in her both eyes with non-reactive pupils. So by the clinical picture, it looks like that's probably we are dealing with an arthritic AION, but her age is one thing that goes against the diagnosis. This was her fundus picture, which showed severe retinal pallor and severe disc pallor. Her angiography also showed characteristically dark choroid and filling defects. Her ESR levels were raised and her CRP levels were also significantly raised. On retrospective history, we saw that she had pain and weakness in muscles for almost 6 months. There was problem with hearing, and there was headache, which was continuously present for past 1 month with severe intensity present in both frontal and temporal region. And there was history of jaw claudication as mentioned earlier. Her physical examination revealed that she had severe pallor, edema, temporal artery tenderness, as well as seventh nerve weakness. So after investigating extensively, we found that she has her renal function test, which were abnormal, and she had a positive P-ANCA test. So a temporal artery biopsy was also done, which was suggestive of vasculitis. A kidney biopsy also was suggestive of vasculitis. So final diagnosis of ANCA-associated anti-ischemic optic neuropathy was made along with post-immune glomerulonephritis. She was started on IV steroids and injection cyclophosphamide. Unfortunately, she did not improve much. As far as vision was concerned, she did not show much of improvement even in spite of the treatment. So I just want to highlight that all AAIONs are not giant cell arthritis. A detailed systemic investigation is required, especially if atypical features are present, as in our case. So the next case, coming to the next case, this was a 48-year-old male who complained of sudden painless loss of vision in right eye, more so in inferior field. He had vision of, I'm sorry for that visual mix-up, he had vision of 4/16 in right eye and 6/6 in left eye, and had a history of hypertension. His fundus looked like this. There was a presence of disc edema in the right eye, while the left eye disc was classically a small disc, which we classically call as a small disc at rest. His angiography were normal, except for there was a segmental disc leak from this segmental leak from the disc. Otherwise, the choroidal picture was normal. So this was a typical case of non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy. We advised him strict blood control and avoidance of nocturnal hypotension by taking his medication early in the evening or in the morning, and avoiding them in the night. The third case is a 50-year-old female who presented with complaints of loss of vision in right eye for past 5 days. She also had a history of single episode of fever almost 20 days back. She was a known case of diabetic mellitus for past 10 years. On examination, her vision was extremely poor in right eye of 1/60, while in left eye it was 6/6, and she had a history of, she also showed RAPT. This was her fundus picture. Right eye showed disc edema over here with a small hemorrhage here, and the left eye was otherwise absolutely normal. So we investigated her further. We did the imaging, and this is what we found. We found that there was a thickened and edematous right optic nerve, and there was bilateral enhancement post-contrast in both the eyes. Right eye showed more enhancement as compared to left eye, and there was also some fat stranding suggestive of atypical optic neuritis. So we went ahead and did serology for her, and we found that she was positive for MOG antibodies. She was treated as per optic neuritis protocol, given 3 days of IV steroids followed by oral prednisolone. However, there was some recovery at the 2 weeks follow-up. I'm yet to follow up her further. So this is the result at 2 weeks. So I just want to say that it is easy to differentiate a non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy from an arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy. The diagnosis is mainly clinical and is aided with blood investigations like ESR and CRP, which are very, very sensitive to pick an arthritic AIN. If they are raised, we are pretty much sure that we are dealing with vasculitis, and they're also used for the monitoring of the disease. While it may be very difficult to differentiate a non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy from the papillitis, especially the MOG-associated papillitis, as Dr. Sachdeva was talking, because these patients not only have the overlap of age, but also the fundus picture, which is seen in form of disc edema as well as hemorrhage. So nowadays it is becoming more and more difficult to differentiate the two, but we may have certain investigations like MRI, which may help in differentiating. The DWI imaging, which is considered more characteristic for ischemic optic neuropathy. So the signals are more commonly seen in ischemic optic neuropathies, but it has also been reported that they are also seen in acute optic neuritis. So in certain cases, we may still be not able to differentiate the two. Similarly, the post-contrast enhancement is also been reported in non-ischemic optic neuropathies, not in acute stage, but in later stage. So that is also an issue when we have to differentiate the two diseases. The role of OCTA is being discussed more and more in differentiating papillitis from non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy. Dr. Virender had very nicely shown how two can be differentiated, and the studies have shown, although it is possible to differentiate a papilledema from papillitis and NAIN, it may be a little difficult to differentiate papillitis from NAIN. Dr. Gandhi et al. In their paper have shown that NAIN in these cases, in NAIN cases, there are two typical pattern of peripapillary capillary loss. One is a diffuse pattern, and another is a focal pattern that was shown by Dr. Sachdeva also. So maybe there may be some subtle sign which may help us in differentiating the two entities, but there are still not any very, very characteristic features that can be used for differentiating. As management is concerned, the management of arthritic AION is straightforward. We use steroids first intravenously and then oral, and that has to be monitored with the help of ESR and CRP. If required, immunosuppressants can be used. As far as non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy is concerned, various medications have been tried, but no definitive management has still come out of it. Steroids have been seen useful in certain subset of patients where the disc edema is more, where the age of patient is less. In those cases, the steroids have shown to have some effect. Anti-VEGF have also been used, but without any definitive result. Similarly, a new molecule QPI 1007 has been tried in a multicentric studies, but it also has not shown to have very encouraging result. So we still do not have a definitive management for NAION except for the modulation of risk factors that are present for this condition. With that, I would like to enter my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Swati. Thank you for keeping the time and that wonderful talk. We have a couple of minutes for discussion, open to expert panel.
Hello, I have a question, Dr. Rashmin. So is a disk at risk is a definitive requisite for developing non-arthritic A1? Because in the case Dr. Swati showed, which turned out to be MOG, I thought the cup was a larger cup, but it eventually turned out to be MOG. So can a larger cup be taken as a exclusive factor for which can exclude non-arthritic A1? Little larger cup.
I am really not sure, Dr. Mahesh, on that, but as you are absolutely right that a small disc is definitely a risk factor for non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathies, but I cannot definitely say that the larger cup will rule it out. But we have seen cases where even the cup was not large, but okay, but still we had non-arthritic ischemic optic neuropathy diagnosed in those cases.
Okay, thank you.
Do you do fluorescent angiography in all patients with NAION, Swati?
No, Dr. Murli, not as a routine, unless we suspect that, you know, something is atypical in those cases.
Thank you. Thank you, Swati. Thank you so much. Next, we have Dr. Padmavati, who is joining us from Arvind Eye Hospital. She's going to talk on cranial nerve palsies. How do I investigate?
A very good evening. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizing committee and Dr. Rashmin for giving me this opportunity to speak on this topic. The topic given to me is cranial nerve palsies. How do I investigate? The minute you think of the cranial nerve palsies, many of us jump to the conclusion that you have to do a neuroimaging. The cranial nerves associated with us is 1 to 12. But for want of time, I will restrict myself to the 3rd, 4th, 6th, not but the least, the 5th and the 7th nerve. So if you see the nerves, they have their origin in the brainstem nuclei and they innervate the extraocular muscle. Any affection along the course of this disease is going to cause a palsy. Associated, any neighboring structures is involved, you tend to have associated neurological signs. The most common thing the cranial nerve palsy will present is most of the patients, they complain of double vision, or it could be an ocular deviation. So whenever you have an oculomotor nerve palsy, you need to have a detailed history with a thorough clinical examination to diagnose a cranial nerve palsy. Before I proceed with my talk, I would like to categorize the cranial nerve palsies. It could be either isolated with no other nerves or no other neurological features, or it could be non-isolated, or it could be multiple, or it could be recurrent nerve palsies. So a diagnosis of any cranial nerve palsies is going to be dependent on the age, because we are setting the age as a criteria. If you think less than 50 years, you will immediately go for neuroimaging. Whereas more than 50 years, we think the vasculopathic risk factors is associated with these conditions. So you tend to wait for these cranial nerve palsies. The duration, what is the duration and onset of the palsy? What is the associated vasculopathic risk factors like hypertension, diabetes, or any coronary artery disease, or any hyperlipidemia, or any other neurological signs like giddiness, ataxia, anything associated with any cranial nerve palsy. So if you want to investigate any cranial nerve palsy, the etiology almost fits into this spectrum of congenital, ischemia, either tumor or inflammation or infectious or trauma. So when do you image in a case of cranial nerve palsy? Over the last decade, as Dr. Virendra had said, the imaging modality has been used left and right by all the ophthalmologists. But we take this as a criteria. If you have a patient with less than 50 years having cranial nerve palsy, the next step is you go for the MRI. If it is more than 50 years, you still consider whether any associated vasculopathic factors is there. So the imaging modality comes when you have associated neurological factors or a progressive course of double vision or long-standing double vision or a known history of carcinoma. There is always a debate in this whether when you have an isolated oculomotor nerve palsy, whether you are going to neuroimage first, because this debate has been going on for the past 1 decade. This was one article where they had their neurological, what was the use of imaging ophthalmologists versus neurologists. If you take the neurologists, all the neurologists, they image all cranial nerve palsies presenting to them. And whereas the ophthalmologists, 2 out of 5 of them, they image the patients because they were concerned about the clinical features as well as the characteristics. This was one major prospective study which had assessed whether neuroimaging is needed early in acute isolated cranial nerve palsy. This study was taken into account for the patients with microvascular risk factors. So they had a total of around 109 patients with presumed microvascular cause, where they found it was 83.5%. The diagnostic yield in these cases was around 16.5%, including the 3rd, 4th, and 6th. Whereas in the 4th and 6th, it was only 4.5%. Their conclusion was an MRI as well as a laboratory workup have a role in the evaluation of older patients with isolated acute oculomotor nerve palsies, regardless of whether vascular risk factors are present. This is actually another coming to our demographics. This is the latest article which was published in the Asia Pacific Academy of Ophthalmology. This was a retrospective study where they found the 6th nerve palsy was a common and ischemia followed by trauma to be the common cause. This is our paper which we had published online. This was a prospective study of 150 cases. We also found the 6th nerve was a common nerve affected and ischemia to be the commonest cause. This is an article which gives you an idea on the etiology of the 3rd, 4th, 6th cranial nerve palsy in the pediatric age group. They found the neoplasia to be the commonest cause, followed by idiopathic and inflammation as the next. So moving on to the individual nerves, whenever you think of a 3rd nerve palsy, you always, the next thing you come to that comes to our mind is the aneurysm. So there are 2 factors which will always help you in guiding the diagnosis. One is the ptosis, whether it is complete or incomplete, or whether there is any pupil involvement, because these are the 2 important signs which will necessitate or order you to go for imaging. So the relative risk of aneurysm is higher when you have a pupil involving 3rd nerve palsy with total impairment of extraocular muscles, or it could be an incomplete 3rd nerve palsy with pupil involvement. So this was a study where they had done for the etiologies of acquired 3rd nerve palsy, where they found the ischemia as well as the compressive to be the next common cause. If you see in this study, the pupil involvement is always, it can be seen in ischemic cases also, and the compressive cases also you can have sometimes a pupil sparing. This was an article which was published in the IJO where they had pupil involvement in 25.7. So I would like to say that pupil sparing doesn't exclude any tumor, or a pupil involvement cannot exclude any vasculopathic or ischemic cause. So this was one patient who had presented to us. If you can see, a mild ptosis, and you can see the abnormal movements. This patient had they had come to us as a incomplete or evolving 3rd nerve palsy. But if you can see, you have signs of aberrant regeneration, which excludes unnecessary investigation because he had a history of trauma long back. And one other thing which is always confound in these cases is incomplete 3rd nerve palsy is an adduction deficit. Many may think it is only a medial rectus involvement, whereas this is a supranuclear affection where you have a adduction deficit with an abducting nystagmus. Other causes of third nerve palsy where you have a pupil involvement, you have an ICA aneurysm, and this is a case where you have a cavernoma with bleed. And these are other causes where you have an inflammatory pituitary adenoma causing a third nerve, or a tuberculoma where you can have recurrences because of the edema. So in a case of isolated third nerve palsy, always rule out a fourth nerve, the pupil, as well as whether the palsy is complete or incomplete, whether you have any signs of aberrant regeneration. This is again in short. You have to work up for the vasculopathic risk factors despite being 50 years also, because we are having patients who have associated vasculopathic risk factors less than 50. And you have to also rule out GCA or any vasculitis in more than 50 years old. The next is the fourth nerve palsy, which is more common with head trauma. And you have a congenital nerve palsy with large vertical fusional amplitude. This is so when you have a fourth nerve palsy, always rule out a bilateral fourth nerve. If it is not, you have to rule out a congenital. The commonest affection is the sixth nerve. The minute you see a sixth nerve palsy, you have to rule out papilledema. And this was one case where we had a sixth and seventh. This was a metastasis in the muscle itself, which was causing, and we had identified the primary. And these are other causes. This is one patient who presented last week with mild deficit post-COVID. So the COVID also has multiple affections of the cranium. The commonest is the sixth nerve. 1 minute. So if you have to, in a case of sixth nerve palsy, you have to find from the second to other nerves. And this is other case where we had a post-COVID with uncontrolled diabetes with the CRAO. And this is a sinusitis, ethmoidal sinusitis. So mucormycosis, thanks to the social media because of the more.
Sorry,
Yeah.
ma'am, for the interruption. Can we look to conclude the?
Yeah, 1 minute. Okay, recurrent nerve palsies. So to conclude, I will always say that if a third nerve palsy, you have to look for pupil involvement. Fourth nerve palsy, rule out congenital. Sixth nerve, first establish if it is isolated. And if it is multiple oculomotor nerve palsies, you have to look for in this pandemic for the mucormycosis. Recurrent nerve palsies, always keep your questionnaire alive till you find out why. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Padmavati. Before we go to the next speaker, maybe we can take one comment. 1 or 2 comments.
I think, hello?
Yes, Dr. Padmavati.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Pandey. I was just saying that there's this debate about imaging and not imaging, is between the ophthalmologists and neurologists. They always like to image and we like to wait and then image. So I think that will, obviously it is a difficult situation and we have a lot of ischemic issues, a lot of diabetes and hypertension. So I think with us, little bit of wait and watch is probably relevant because we have a large population which have uncontrolled diabetes and hypertension, and the incidence of ischemic etiologies we see far more, I think, frequently, as you would agree with me. So I think little wait is better. And the isolated palsy like papilledema comes, it is not isolated anymore. So for isolated palsy, like fourth nerve palsy is quite often isolated because there is very little which is around this. Third nerve palsy and sixth nerve, if they're not ischemic, they tend to be non-isolated, maybe.
Can I ask one question to Dr. Padmavati?
Yes, Professor.
Yeah, yes.
Dr. Padmavati, you said there was a people involving third nerve palsy in ICA. Which part of the ICA aneurysm was?
The main internal, in the cavernous sinus, it was in the cavernous sinus.
There will be multiple nerve involvement then.
No, I had almost 2 or 3 cases presenting unilateral. One was bilateral ICA aneurysm, and one was
because in cavernous sinus ICA aneurysm, 6 is the first one to be involved.
But we had more of third.
That lies just in the cavity because 6 lies in the cavity, while the third lies in the wall of the cavernous sinus. And the most part of the ICA, it is extradural. Only when it perforates the cavernous sinus roof, it becomes intradural or subarachnoid. And at that part, the third nerve is very way away from that. It's the optic nerve, which is much more compressed in the aneurysm.
To be a PCA aneurysm, if it is third nerve, to be a PCA.
other than direct ICA aneurysm.
All right.
Just one comment I'd like to make. In this pandemic, I'm seeing a lot of cases with cranial nerve palsies, which is on the rise. And one, interestingly, during the peak that we had about the second wave in Bangalore, we realized a lot of them were coming with oculomotility abnormality. And then what we realized was actually the mucor infiltrating the muscles and not purely related to just the cranial nerve. But now with the wave coming down and mucor being controlled, it is less. But getting infiltration of the muscles was something interestingly that we found.
Oh, interesting.
One is neurogenic, one is myogenic. So one
Let's
is
move on to
optical attack syndrome, which is neurogenic, and then this is direct infiltration, which is probably more of a myogenic and sort of restrictive etiology. So
Yes.
both components could be there, I think. We need to work it out and do probably a BT and C.
Yes, yes, yes.
Can I ask a question to Dr. Jyoti, please?
Can we move to the next?
Can we move to the next speaker? Because I
Yes,
think
actually,
we're
we're
not
running
able-
out of time. We need to move to the next
Can we
speaker.
have Dr. Jasprit Sukhija, who is joining us from PGI Chandigarh? Jasprit, he's going to talk about toxic optic neuropathy.
So thank you, Dr. Rashmin, for this kind invitation in this symposium. So after those lovely talks, let's get toxic now and how this affects the optic nerve. So toxic is basically because of toxins. These toxins could be just anything ranging from drugs, antibiotics, alcohols, anti-cancer agents, heavy metals, tobacco, alcohol. Yes, the commoner ones, what we usually see here in our clinics is the ethambutol toxicity, because many of them are, their TB cases are quite a few in this country, and so they are on ethambutol. Plus you have the readily available methanol here in this country. So some of these are common, whereas others are probably based on maybe prolonged treatment. So what are the salient features of this toxic optic neuropathy? When you talk of toxic optic neuropathy, it means basically a bilateral symmetrical visual loss. Could be a little asymmetry, but yes, finally it's a symmetrical visual loss, typically painless and progressive. The visual loss would be, you can say, would not go beyond 20/400 in most of the cases, except when you have an acute methanol poisoning. Because it's central fiber involvement of the optic nerve, you will have a centrocecal scotoma or a central scotoma affecting the papillomacular bundle. And of course, one of the early signs is dyschromatopsia in these patients. So what basically the primary lesion could basically involve the ganglion cells of the retina and then probably the optic nerve or the optic tract directly. What it is actually a acquired mitochondriopathy. So these are the mitochondria which are involved and lead to the axonal swellings as well. So basically an imbalance between the intracellular and the extracellular free radical hemostasis, which is responsible for the injury. So it's a diagnosis of exclusion. I mean, no doubt the history is very important. I mean, when the patient comes with it, but yes, you have to rule out other things before finally jumping on to say, you have to investigate the patient before finally saying that it is a toxic optic neuropathy. As in optic nerve disorders, dyschromatopsia is an early symptom usually for the red. The patient could initially present with a blur, fog, or a cloud at a point of fixation before finally maybe after a couple of days or hours, he says that yes, he's losing vision. So there is a rapid decline in visual acuity over just maybe a few hours or days to 20/400. Bilaterally is the rule, and it could be one more than other in the initial phases. It's typically painless. Pupils are normal to light and air stimulation, except in a few cases of poisoning, I can say, like that of methanol. The disc may be normal to look at, or could be have, if you see like in a very early phase, there could be swelling mimicking any kind of optic neuritis as well, and there could be atrophy in the later stages. So obviously, when you have to rule out all these things, we have to basically consider just every kind of you can say optic neuritis when we're having all these things, although it's bilateral symmetrical, but an atypical optic neuritis can present in that way. So it's overlapping features unless you have a kind of a fairly evident disc picture, or then you go ahead for your the contrast and MRI scan of the brain and orbit, and it could give you some kind of clues when you have a chiasmal involvement or an optic nerve involvement or maybe other parts of the brain, and then you check for other deficiencies, maybe B12, because nutritional are also mixed with all these things. Serum folate levels, serum lead levels are very important. routine hemogram, RFT, LFT are important because some of these drugs toxicity get exaggerated when you have a decreased function of the kidneys. Syphilis serology needs to be ruled out because you have to exclude things specific and work towards a specific intoxicant if suspected. The readily available OCT, the tool we have in our OPDs is the OCT, where we can find how you can say the loss of the ganglion cell layer. Maybe early on it might not be detected, but those coming at a later stage might give some kind of a clue to what pattern are we following in the OCT. So some of the common toxic neuropathies which I would like to discuss here is maybe one of the commonest one because of the ATT we are using is ethambutol. The incidence which is about 6%, and it has been shown it is dose and duration dependent. 25 milligram per kg per day is the dose probably where when it is used would lead to some kind of an optic neuropathy. But yes, there is no, it can even occur at doses as low as maybe 12 or 13 milligram it says. So basically you have to keep a close watch on these patients. The visual acuity is like loss is central, it's a central scotoma, you have a color vision deficit, or it can present in the peripheral type of a defect like a bitemporal field defect when you have a chiasmitis along with the red-green defect. So the visual problem are usually not suddenly in these cases. It generally seen after 2 months, except those where you have a renal dysfunction where a dose like a lesser dose could cause an early defect. So subclinical toxicity can be picked by contrast testing and OCT. And the management is, of course, stop the drug, follow-up and reversibility is generally is unpredictable. So we have one case here, a 60-year-old male who presented with decreased vision in both eyes since 1 month, which was insidious in onset, painless, progressive. He had been on ATT for 4 months and with a dose of 22.8 milligram per kg per day. So that dose, so he presented with counting fingers close to at 2 meters, 660 in the left eye. The visual fields, like obviously they show a central scotoma in both the eyes with involvement of the other parts of the field as well. And the optic disc had temporal pallor in both the eyes. He could not read the demo plate. Even with the 660 vision, he could not read the demo plate. So he was off ethambutol for 25 days. He had been stopped somewhere else. And of course, we did give a trial of methylprednisolone probably. I think he was referred from our neurology department probably. Yes, they had given the methylpred for 5 days and of course some multivitamin injection. At 5 weeks follow-up, his visual acuity did improve to 6.9. So I could have, it's difficult to say whether this methylprednisolone helped. Probably so some of these studies have shown that in acute cases probably might work for some time. Posterior segment, yes, had a pale optic disc, and if on serial follow-up at presentation, you can see how the visual field has improved over time in both the eyes. But yes, he does have a central scotoma in both the eyes still at 12 weeks. The second is isoniazid, which is used along with the ATT, and it's part of the ATT regime. But yes, the good point is that the visual acuity returns to normal on stopping this drug. More often, these patients have disc edema, bitemporal heminopia. Again, when you have renal dysfunction, basically the chances of toxicity are much high. But yes, if you have both the drugs and with ethambutol, if it's not really, if your visual loss is not decreasing probably, then you might have to think of isoniazid as a contributory factor. The other one is like methanol, which is a spirit which is easily available in these industrial houses. So it's a clear, colorless, flammable liquid, popularly known as wood alcohol. And formic acid is a toxin which is responsible for the toxicity. And CNS symptoms and severe visual loss occur after 12 to 24 hours. So it causes CNS symptoms as well. But yes, there are a few patients who had presented with just the visual loss. So dilated pupils that react poorly to light but accommodate, and in the early stages the disc may be hyperemic and edematous, but yes, over a period of time it does lead to disc pallor. This is just another case of a 50-year-old male who presented with sudden painless bilateral loss of vision since 2 days, had a history of alcohol take followed by episodes of dizziness, managed conservatively outside probably, and at presentation he was denying light perception in both the eyes. Pupils were fixed, dilated, non-reacting, with the grade 4 disc edema in the right eye and grade 3 in the left eye with few flame-shaped hemorrhages in the peripapillary area. So this is the patient with dilated pupils, and you have basically a florid disc edema with the hemorrhages occurring here. Now these things are really confusing. I mean, although the pupils are dilated, but obviously he's giving a history of alcohol intoxication. Bilateral denies PL, but yes, it could be overlapping with the other you can say other diagnosis of maybe some kind of a severe optic neuritis or issue like this. So one has to be careful. You have to take a proper history along with of course the bilaterality of the symmetrical and bilateral involvement of the optic of the eyes. So the late eyedness were all fine. So basically the abnormal finding was basically this thing in both the eyes. But yes, when we obviously we'll get a scan in these patients. So when we got a scan, probably they had a putamenal necrosis, and which is quite typical of methanol poisoning. So basically, central nervous system appears to affect when the methanol levels above 20, ocular symptoms above 100. Fatalities have occurred in the range of 150 to 200 milligrams. And putamen is particularly at risk to various pathological processes because of the high metabolic demand it has. So this is just to show you some of the publications where in acute stages probably they have used intravenous methylprednisolone and showed improvement in visual acuity. So it is an option. Our patient improved to hand motion from PL negative after intravenous methylprednisolone. So prevention is the key with baseline evaluation, and before starting drug treatment, early detection can help salvage vision. Stop the offending agent is the only management option, and a diagnostic clue as well. Because obviously, when you stop and the vision improves, yes, you're right in what you're diagnosed. And follow up with testing when certain drugs can help detect toxicity earlier. I think with that I end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasprit. Any comments?
Yeah, there was something on the incidence 6%. What was that? I mean, there was some. Dr. Satya said.
Yes, Satya, would you like to come in since you have worked on this topic?
No comments.
No comments? All right. If there are no other comments, then we'll move on to our next talk. That is Dr. Murli joining us from Eye Foundation, Coimbatore. And he's going to talk about myasthenia gravis.
My sincere thanks to Dr. Rashmin for having invited me, and to the INOS for inviting me in this wonderful AIO session. So I'll start on our experience with myasthenia gravis. So as we all know that it's an antibody-mediated response, and it peaks in younger women and older men. And pure ocular myasthenia gravis is more common in older men. So we come into the picture because ptosis and diplopia are 50%, the initial sign in 50%, and eventually they go on to develop in 90%. This is the order of affection that generally happens, but the ptosis could come on later as well. This is not a sine qua non. And so when we ask for the history, we need to inquire about diurnal variation of ptosis, diplopia, and we also need to ask about systemic weakness. So ptosis is very characteristic. It's a fatigable ptosis. So as the patient looks up, in MRC oft we were taught it was 15 seconds, but the latest Kansky says it's 40 seconds. I probably would wait for 40 seconds to demonstrate the fatigable ptosis. And it's also characterized by rapid recovery. This is the Cogan's lit twitch sign. So we ask the patient to look down for 15 to 20 seconds and ask him or her to look straight on. So this overshoot and lid hopping is very characteristic of ocular myasthenia gravis. And orbicularis involvement, orbicularis oculi involvement, not very common. If you see, the lid closure is not very great on this side. So this combination of LPS and orbicularis oculi happens in only 3 conditions. Ocular myasthenia gravis is the foremost. It can also happen in myotonic dystrophy and CPEO. And we all know this test. It's better to use a glove filled with ice rather than an ice pack, because the glove molds to the contour. And after 2 minutes of ice, it's 2 minutes for ptosis and 5 minutes for ophthalmoparesis. After 2 minutes of ice, the ptosis improves. The improvement lasts only for 15 to 20 seconds. And a high incidence of variability. If you notice, this patient initially presented with a left ptosis and a left depression restriction. And he went away. I mean, he declined treatment even though he was anti-acetylcholine receptor antibody positive. He came back 3 months later. This time he presents with a right ptosis and the left depression restriction persists. So this change from left to right ptosis, this kind of high variability. And there has been one case report in survey ophthalmology where after surgery an esotropia went into exactly the same amount of exotropia. High variability is very characteristic of ocular myasthenia gravis. So if you see here, this is a seesaw sign. When you lift this eyelid, the other eyelid droops, and this happened over the examination. And the weakness doesn't conform to any particular pattern. If you see, he has a right ptosis and a left adduction restriction. This can also happen in a nuclear third nerve palsy. All these patients undergo an MRI brain with contrast. And I request the radiologist that if there is nothing on the brain, please scan the mediastinum as well. So that takes care of both at the same time. And this is a very classic thing. When you lifted the right eyelid, the left eye starts drooping. If you notice, I'll show the video next. And this patient initially presented with right ptosis. So the seesaw sign shows that the ptosis is actually bilateral. So there you go. You retract the right upper lid and the left upper lid starts drooping. So seesaw sign is because of Herring's law, and this shows that the ptosis is bilateral actually. And yeah, this patient has, this is another patient. He presented with left abduction weakness, but both sides ptosis. So again, this doesn't conform to any particular pattern. MRI brain was normal. So not conforming to any particular pattern with negative neuroimaging. Negative neuroimaging meaning MRI brain with contrast goes strongly in favor of myasthenia gravis. And a high level of variability, which I was talking about. This patient presented with left eye ptosis on one day. A week later, he comes back with right eye ptosis. So these are the ocular motility initially was full, but the elevation was slightly restricted. He didn't complain of any double vision. So initially left eye ptosis, a week later, the left eye ptosis is resolved on its own without any treatment, because many of these patients, they're not very convinced initially to start treatment. So when they come back to us, they present with a completely different clinical picture. And this patient, presented with a left adduction restriction, and during the period of examination, she develops a right ptosis. Again, she already had the MRI when she came to me. So this kind of, not conforming to any particular pattern, highly variable ptosis, all this goes in favor of myasthenia. This is a very interesting clinical sign. So this patient had a left abduction restriction. So I made him look to the right for quite some time, for 120 to 180 seconds. And then asked him to abduct again. So if you see, there is a subtle abduction improvement. You can measure the abduction improvement by the distance from the canthus to the limbus, and the subtle abduction improvement. So if you give the involved muscle some rest, like in this case, I asked the patient to look to the other side for 180 seconds, the weakness actually improves. So the neostigmine test, sometimes use it in doubtful cases. So you give 1.5 milligram of neostigmine, intramuscular or intravenous, along with glycopyrrolate pre-medication with the anesthetist on. If you don't see any improvement in 45 minutes, it's declared as negative. Generally, we start seeing improvement from 2 to 2 minutes if IV is given, and from 15 minutes if IM is given. So the helpful tips are that all these which I have shown in the videos, orbicularis oculi weakness, while you don't see it very often. So we get all these investigations done in addition to MRI brain with contrast and mediastinum. We request for a RNST. Had a very helpful neurologist who used to do single fiber EMG. His electrode is broken now. And he was not able to. He's not able to get it repaired because of the pandemic. And of course, anti-ACH receptor antibody, anti-MuSK, I don't get it routinely done. And neostigmine cases when there is a strong doubt. So diagnosis, of course, is clinical, guided along with neuroimaging. So this is a typical patient who had this thing. All these antibody assays currently do binding and currently assay only the binding antibodies, and most of the labs do a radioimmunoassay. So the role of blocking and modulating antibodies, we don't know. More than 0.4 is considered as positive, and this RNST, while it is positive in only 25% of patients with pure ocular myasthenia gravis, a reduction in 10 to 15% at 3 Hz stimulation is considered to be characteristic. And in addition, this patient had a thyroid-associated orbitopathy. So Graves' disease is also associated with myasthenia gravis, which needs to be kept in mind. So this was by my neurologist, Dr. Arul Selvan. He was kind enough to share this picture with me. And this was single fiber EMG when he was still doing. Single fiber EMG is you stimulate a single axon and you assess the end plate potentials in all the muscles innervated by a single axon. So there is a normal physiological jitter which happens because of difference in latencies. But an enhanced jitter is highly suggestive. Increased jitter, which is highlighted in red. I requested him to highlight this in red. So this done from the right orbicularis oculi. We are very interested in orbicularis oculi. So orbicularis oculi, increased jitter is highly suggestive. It's virtually diagnostic of myasthenia if there is a suggestive clinical picture. So this was again a very typical patient. So had bilateral ptosis, improved with ICE test. Why I put up this patient is because she also had a thymoma on mediastinal imaging. You can see a little bit of calcification here in the thymoma, and she died 4 months after diagnosis because of metastasis. So this was suspected lithium-induced. This is to bring out drug-induced myasthenia gravis, suspected lithium-induced myasthenia gravis, but she really didn't improve much, and we are not very sure why this ptosis came. There was some this thing that could be aponeurotic ptosis because of the deep lid crease, but she was mildly positive on ICE test. She was mildly positive on ICE test. So coming to the treatment, you have these goals. I mean, let me frankly admit, if there are any systemic features, I get the neurologist in the loop. I let him do the treatment and I guide him in the dosage. But if it's pure ocular and there are no cardiac contraindication, I get a ECG done before instituting pyridostigmine. And there are no cardiac thing. If there is only ptosis, I start with pyridostigmine starting twice daily. And in case there is ophthalmoplesis, we start with an escalating dose of steroid. We start with an escalating steroid along with vitamin D and calcium. And often this treatment goes on for a very long time. So we start with an escalating dose because starting with a high dose sometimes can produce a paradoxic worsening of ocular myasthenia gravis. I have never seen, I mean, I have seen this only once in ocular myasthenia gravis, and 60 milligrams is the maximum dose that I have given. And if 60 milligrams there is no response, even after 6 weeks, like I escalate to 60 milligram and then water it down to the least possible alternate day dosage that the patient is symptom free. And we also need to give the patient this chart. My neurologist always gives them this chart saying what all medications to avoid. There are a huge number of medications. I would say that we have operated on a few cataracts and we have used topical, topical fluoroquinolones. We've not had any problem, but systemic fluoroquinolones are a definite no-no, or you should use, if at all, it has to be used in consultation with the neurologist. So ophthalmic assistive devices, occasionally we do need to give them crush glasses if they are inadequately responding to pyridostigmine and steroids they are not able to tolerate. And if we need to give them immunomodulatory, I again get the neurologist in the loop. So diplopia, which is not responding, can be managed with eye patching, mild strabismus prisms. And they say if 9 to 12 months it has been stable, you can operate. I do not have any experience with surgery in this group of patients. So at each visit, I start treatment with steroids. I review them at 3 weeks. If it is with pyridostigmine, at 1 week. And at each visit, I ask them for dysphagia, limb or girdle weakness, and difficulty in breathing or swallowing. If they report any of these, however mild it may be, I request a neurologist to have an evaluation. I don't want to be the only one treating them. And I let the neurologist do the treatment. I monitor the patient. And if they have had steroids for 6 months or more in young patients and 3 months or more older patients, I get a DEXA bone scan. If there is osteoporosis, I request, I get the orthopedician in loop to institute palmidronate or calcitonin, whichever he may consider appropriate in that situation. So these are a few of the successfully treated patients.
You would have to conclude.
Yeah, I conclude. So thank you so much. And
Thank you so much, Murli. Nice talk. Any comments as I invite Dr. Himalini, who's joining us from Mumbai?
One thing I wanted to say, Dr. Rashmin, that some of these patients are having autoimmune disorders like thyroid and diabetes. And if you're giving steroids, one has to be careful because they are sharing that etiology with myasthenia gravis. So one has to look into thyroid particularly and diabetes also. And the response is, the steroid response I've seen is quite good at times. It's quite rapidly response. And thymoma, of course, has to be in younger age group. You have to look at these conditions. And I think internist referral is always good because the systemic aspects are there. So one should always probably take an opinion from a neurologist. And I think imaging is not always essential in all the cases, Dr. Muridhar. Why image if you know the diagnosis? Neuroimaging, does it really help?
So if it's unilateral ptosis, I don't image. If it's unilateral ptosis, but if it is bilateral ptosis, primarily to rule out any nuclear third nerve, I get them to image, and at the same time, I get the mediastinum imaged also. But maybe you're correct. I mean, in typical cases, it may not be.
Yeah, probably there's no need until there's a reason to image. Of course, for thymoma, let that be decided by the physician. I think let them take that decision if they want to do it.
Dr. Muralidhar, how often,
Yes.
Dr. Muralidhar, how
Yes,
often have you seen this Kogan lid tissue sign in these cases of ocular myasthenia?
Madam, we actually have a series. We have submitted it to the journal, and it's I mean, it's a pending review. We have seen it in around 37%. We've seen it.
Okay. Well, you've been very lucky with all these signs. Quite often you don't get all these signs, and I would say quite often they are quite sort of chronic situations. They don't change so much, So I'm really good that I'm happy you showed all those signs, which have been very good. Nice presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Can we invite our next speaker if
Yeah.
this may be-
Okay,
We're kind
Malini.
of running out of time. Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Malini, you can start.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Can
you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Slide show?
Yeah, we can make it a slide show.
Yeah. So the so I've the topic given to me is interesting cases, and I've chosen a theme for these interesting cases, and that is abduction deficit, because one needs to emphasize that abduction deficit is a sign, and one needs to determine the underlying cause. So the first case is that of a 6-year-old village girl who noticed double vision, and she complained to a school teacher. School teacher looked at her. She thought that the eye was squinting, and so brought her to the ophthalmologist. There was no history of any fever, fall, vaccination, or any other systemic illness. The double vision was constant, horizontal. She had binocular diplopia. Overall health was very good. So this is a child with a lateral rectus palsy. This is the primary gaze, and you see the abduction deficit in the right eye. The ocular examination was normal, including the fundus, and the only positive sign was a right-sided lateral rectus palsy. So at this point, the differentials in my mind were, am I looking at an inflammatory, infective? Is it an SOL, demyelinating, myasthenia? So the next thing we decided was to get an MRI. The MRI showed a very large patch of pachymeningitis in the left temporal region, as you see in this picture. And then there was enhancement of the sixth nerve, as you see in this slide. So with the MRI, my differentials were narrowed down to probably an inflammatory cause, either caused by a sarcoid or an IgG4 or an infective, because TB is widely endemic in our country. So we investigated her thoroughly. Unfortunately, we could not do the IG4 because of paucity of funds, but TB was extensively investigated. We couldn't find any TB test positive, including the CSF tab, which showed no increase in the protein or lactate levels, indicating that there was no infection. So what next? We decided to do a brain biopsy to rule out a tuberculoma or a lymphoma. And that was also reported as normal, except for inflammatory cells. So without wasting much time, we started the patient on IV methylprednisolone. There was recovery of the abduction by day 3. The patient was then put on oral steroids, which were very, very slowly tapered. The post-steroid, immediately on day 3, like I said, the abduction improved, as you see in this picture here. And this is the previous pachymeningitis, and post-treatment, the pachymeningitis is resolving. So what was really the diagnosis? I'm really not sure. TB in our country is endemic and therefore needs to be extensively investigated. While exercising brain biopsy, one must make sure that you take an adequate tissue sample size. Maybe in this case, there was not the tissue sample was not adequate, and therefore we didn't get anything positive. If there is some time, then maybe the panel can opine if anything more needed to be done for this case from investigation point of view. The second case is that of a 60-year-old who complained of sudden onset double vision. Again, his double vision was constant. He was a hypertensive. The only positive sign was the right eye abduction limitation. The fundus was normal. So this is the primary gaze of the picture. This is the abduction deficit in the right eye. Keeping in mind that the patient was a hypertensive and he was an older age, I made a diagnosis of an ischemic right lateral rectus palsy and decided to observe the patient for 1 month. And while I asked the patient to observe, I asked him to follow up with his physician to control the hypertension, and I also started aspirin. But a word of caution was that please report back if there was any worsening of the symptoms. A month later, there was no worsening of the symptoms, but there was no improvement either. And therefore, I asked for an MRI. And the MRI showed a small enhancing nodule, as you see in this picture, in the anterior cavernous sinus. This patient was then treated with steroids after doing a full inflammatory workup, including a CSF tap. And since both the above were normal, he was started on steroids. No sooner than we started the steroids, the abduction deficit in this eye has improved. So the take-home message is that when you see a diabetic or a hypertensive sixth nerve palsy, and if the rest of the ocular examination is normal, particularly the fundus, one would surely think it's ischemic. But one needs to remember that if there's no improvement in a few weeks, or if there's worsening, then must get the neuroimaging done. But this case reinforces my belief that all cranial nerve palsies need to be neuroimaged irrespective. The third case is that of a 14-year-old. She complained of binocular diplopia. Vision was 6/6, fundus was normal. So this was the primary gaze of the picture of the patient. And this was the side gaze where you see the abduction deficit on both sides. So she had a bilateral sixth nerve palsy. Her fundus was normal. So this patient, we decided to get an MRI done, but being in a government hospital, she was scheduled for an MRI 7 days later. Meanwhile, we got a CT scan done at least to make sure that we were not dealing with any tumor. A couple of days later, while she was waiting for her MRI, she landed up in the emergency department with drowsiness, severe headache, and persistent double vision, at which point an urgent MRI was done. And the MRI revealed this kind of extensive areas of leptomeningeal enhancement suggestive of inflammation, most likely because of TB meningitis. So a take-home message that I learned in this case is that definitely there's no role of CT scan when you see any cranial nerve palsy. And there has to be a clear communication between the ophthalmologist and radiologist, because we could not document the enhancement of the sixth nerve as the cuts that of the MRI were taken were too thick. So these were the investigations. All the investigations were pointing towards TB, including the gene expert and the pyrosequencing. The proteins was high. And the child was immediately started with AKT treatment, supplemented with IV steroids. She followed up with us 2 weeks later. On follow-up visit, the abduction deficit was present, but much less than before, as you see in this picture. So you see that the abduction deficit has improved. So TBM is associated with increased mortality as well as morbidity. And because of the variability of the disease, early diagnosis can sometimes be difficult. It can present as a unilateral or a bilateral sixth nerve palsy. And particularly, you have to keep in mind to make sure that the sixth nerve palsy is not a false localizing sign. Increased proteins in the CSF along with the gyral enhancement, as you saw in this case, are classical features of TBM. And why did the patient present with a bilateral sixth nerve palsy? Because the gelatinous exudates cause the entrapment of the sixth nerve. The sixth nerve is commonly involved, followed by the third nerve because of their long course. There was particular interest in this case because unilateral involvement is common, but bilateral involvement of sixth nerve is rare in TBM. The last case is that of a young girl. She was overweight. She again complained of a little bit of a headache and horizontal diplopia, which was constant. The ocular examination, her vision was normal except for the right esotropia with the abduction deficit, as you see in this picture. This is the fundus examination. Now, the fundus examination revealed disc edema more on the right as compared to the left. And this is what she looked like. She was overweight and she had this blackish pigmentation suggestive that maybe she was insulin resistant, probably because of a PCOD. So how does one approach this patient? So if you come across an LR palsy with disc edema, then the LR palsy is a false localizing sign, suggesting of a raised intracranial pressure, and that's your take-home message from this case. So in such a patient, you would want to do an MRI. If the MRI is normal, go ahead and do a MRI venogram because you want to rule out sinus venous thrombosis. And if both are normal, then do a CSF tap, document the opening pressure if high, suggestive of a benign intracranial hypertension. So this was the MRI venogram, which was normal. The patient was then diagnosed as benign intracranial hypertension, treated with Dimox, counseled to meet an endocrinologist, weight loss. It was advised and emphasized, and within 2 weeks, her disc edema resolved. The last case is that of a child where the parents noticed that the child was not able to turn his eyes outwards. Again, before he came to me, he was diagnosed as a bilateral laterectus palsy. He was extensively investigated, including the neuroimaging. And he was sent for a second opinion as everything was normal, including the vision and the fundus. And this is what the child looked like, an esotropia and bilateral abduction deficit, as you see on both the sides. But if you take a closer look at this patient, you see a narrowing of the palpebral fissure when the child was trying an attempted abduction. And what you see here is the leash effect, which is commonly seen in a Duane's syndrome. And this
can we sum it up in next 30 seconds?
Yeah. So the last patient, infantile esotropia along with Duane's syndromes can often be mistaken with abduction deficit and mistakenly diagnosed as lateral rectus palsy. And a simple test is to patch the good eye and you see that the abduction deficit has resolved. So to summarize, abduction deficit is a sign. It has several causes. A correct and planned approach is required for determining the underlying cause. Beware of Duane's and infantile esotropias because these are often confused with lateral rectus palsy. Thank you.
Dr. Hemamani, can I ask some question regarding this? A wonderful 5 cases, but I'm interested on the first case. You see, what is the cell type seen in the histopathology that's more important? Because if you see a lymphocyte in this, it shows a chronicity of the disease against a neutrophilic involvement, which shows acute inflammation. Now you see whether there was a plasma cells in this histopathology, because if you see a sporiform pattern of involvement, it can give a clue for IgG4 related disease. Okay. Correct. Then where immunohistochemistry for IgG4 against the plasma cell better things. Now, if there is a epithelioid cells, it can be a sarcoid or a tuberculosis. Okay. And whether you have done an AFB stain for this particular spatial stain for this. These are very, very important to rule out the possible etiological causes.
Agree, sir. But I feel that the brain biopsy sample was not adequately taken, was not appropriately taken. So it gave a very non-specific report. And then it had already been a month since we had seen the patient. So then without wasting much time, since we had ruled out an infective etiology, we started the patient on steroids.
So this brain biopsy is quite invasive, I think. Is it indicated? Some neurosurgeons advise that we should go for a brain biopsy. I think it's quite invasive procedure and it may do damage at times. And ultimately, patient responded to steroids, as you were rightly saying. There was nothing positively gained, and response was to the steroids, which was probably, as somebody is saying, that
this patient was jointly treated by me and a pediatric neurologist, and the pediatric neurologist was not shy in asking for a brain biopsy. So I think
it was not
that is invasive procedure. I think
it was not a brain biopsy. It was a dural biopsy.
Yeah.
It must be a dural biopsy, which they do for Pachymeningitis. And secondly, tell me how the 6 was involved, because the Pachymeningitis I could see in the lateral wall, laterally, in the temporal cortex, laterally. So where the 6, how the 6 is involved? Was it extending to cavernous sinus, superior orbital fissure? And I've doubted how it is involved.
There was we just detected an enhancement of the 6 nerve, which I've shown the picture, but there was no involvement of the cavernous sinus.
Did you do the Fiesta imaging? They do the Fiesta imaging to. They do in neuroradiology, they do the Fiesta imaging to visualize the path of the cranial nerve. Did they do that?
They did do that, but see, this was a government setup. Working with limitation.
We did a biopsy. The point is, if it is bilateral 6 nerve, it should always be neuroimaged. That is, I think, the take-home message. We should never overlook a bilateral 6 nerve involvement. Or if it is non-isolated, if there is papilledema, these cases have to be treated differently than an isolated 6 nerve, unilateral 6 nerve. That is my feeling.
Any other comments, Pradeep Sharma sir?
I think it's been a wonderful session all through, and finally rounding up with the interesting cases with Dr. Himalini has shown. And I think these topics have been well covered in spite of the time shortage that we have. There will be many questions. We can probably have them on the chat, which was going on simultaneously, and many people have participated in that. So it was a wonderful session. So I don't know if we have more time, or Shivani is going to kick us out.
I've requested for 5 more minutes.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I would like to give a comment. I had one patient who had a 6-nerve palsy. Unfortunately, the same presentation, the lower cranial nerve examination, they picked out the 12th nerve affection also in that case. It was a case of idiopathic hypertrophic pachymeningitis only. It was a young diabetic. He had almost recurrence for 2 or 3 times. I had to start him on immunosuppressants. So that was unusual, but I didn't go for a dural biopsy because the patient was reluctant for the invasive procedure.
Sometimes it is idiopathic also.
Yeah.
Not necessarily associated with systemic disorder, but maybe idiopathic.
Before concluding idiopathic, you have to rule out all other causes.
Many of our idiopathics are not enough diagnosed.
We don't know, yeah, that's true. What we don't know, we say idiopathic. It's no diagnosis actually.
So I think it's, thank you, Rashmin, and thanks to the AOS for having this National Symposium on Neuro-Ophthalmology, and thanks to all the panelists for taking time and presenting.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. Thanks a lot from scientific committee team.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank you, Rashmin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shivani, for coordinating it well and making sure that everybody restricts to the time.
Cases were nice. Hey, Malini, the cases were good.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Very good case.
Bye bye. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
everyone.
Stay safe.
With this, we sum up our last session for the day. Thank you, everyone, for cooperating and for this wonderful and informative session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy your dinner. Okay, bye-bye.